And welcome to the Americas Zone of the Talent Summit of the Singapore FinTech Festival. I'm Glenn Van Zutphen. This is, of course, the final day of the FinTech Festival. Here on the Global Common Channel, we have our last cohort of high-level thought leaders and global policymakers for you today. Now, today we're going to take a look at the new work equation that we're all getting used to. And as we have all week, there are lots of great content moments for you on the green shoots and hyperlocal channels, which are curated, of course, by our partners in FinTech hubs around the world. And we hope that you'll take a trip to our online city as well for virtual networking, meetups, mentorship, and deal making. Our final session of the end of today will be a very special fireside chat that I'm going to have with scientist and former professional poker player Liv Boeree. Now, you may be wondering what that has to do with the FinTech Festival. You're going to be surprised to find out what she has to say. This session will not be available, unfortunately, in recording, so you're going to have to stay tuned to watch it live. That's at the end of today's FinTech Festival. And let's start our America's Zone today with the next generation of open source software developers. They are already coming from around the world, as you all well know, including developing nations and regions. How can current developers and organizations pave the way for these up-and-coming developers to have a successful career in open source software? Well, let's get some insight into that growing pool of developers from Erica Brescia, Chief Operating Officer at GitHub. Over to Erica as she shares her opinions on what can support the development of next-gen developers.
Hello, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone joining today. While I miss seeing friends in person, the shift to virtual events has had a huge impact on making conferences like this more accessible to folks all over the world. And that's actually pretty relevant to what I'm here to talk about today. So let's dive in. The amount of software that we, the human race, will rely on in the coming decades will grow exponentially. Our cars will continue to get smarter. Software will help us diagnose, treat, and even prevent illness. It will help us develop solutions that improve the health of our planet, combat climate change, food shortages, and resource constraints, often in close partnership with members of the financial services industry. And behind all of that is open source, a community that many of you watching today are likely a critical part of. In order to support the proliferation of software, to maintain the technology we already have and create the software of the future, we need the open source community to grow too. We need more developers, more maintainers, and more contributors to help meet the ever-increasing demand for software. And what's amazing is how quickly we're already starting to see this happen. So how does the existing open source community support this growth? How do we pave a path for new developers to overcome challenges and make a contribution and ensure the innovation and quality of this community continues to grow along with its size? How do we give some of the tireless maintainers out there a much-deserved break? To support the continued growth and health of open source, we need to create an open source culture where anyone can be a contributor and grow to be a maintainer. We need to continue to unleash the network effects of every commit. And perhaps most significantly, we need to enable local and global commercial opportunity through open source. First, let's talk about contributors and the importance of open source development as a viable career path. Today, there are more than 50 million developers on GitHub. In 5 years, we expect that number to double. That's 100 million developers who are going to be critical to the acceleration of human progress in the coming decades. They're going to come from all over the world, but especially from developing nations where learning to code and contributing to open source is a path to economic growth and prosperity. This is a map of where in the world contributions on GitHub are happening. 5 years ago, the majority of open source contributions were being made in the Western world. Over time, we start to see more and more regions growing in terms of contributors. And now you can see that the epicenter of open source contribution is moving away from the Western world. As we move into the future, we see places like India, China, Africa, and Latin America really start to light up. There is an acceleration happening in open source contributions from outside the Western world, and this is going to intensify over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm going to share a stat that still boggles my mind. My son is 8, and in his lifetime, 80% of the world population will reside in Asia and Africa. The developing world is really going to drive a lot of the innovation and progress we see in the next few decades. And the world is going to be richer, more dynamic, and more inclusive because of this interconnected open source community we're all continuing to build together. Let's zoom in to the impact that open source can have on someone's life. This is Sonia John, blockchain developer, writer, and speaker in Kenya who recently participated in the GitHub README project. She was 25 when hyperinflation hit South Sudan and she lost her job and 90% of her savings. She felt like she'd lost everything and was starting to feel desperate. In her own words, she moved to Kenya, bought a cheap laptop, installed Ubuntu, because that's what she heard developers do, and taught herself how to code. She leveraged resources from other open source maintainers and developers from around the world to learn HTML and CSS, and then started building basic websites and Python-based messenger bots. She didn't have a degree in computer science or an internship with a software company. She had a laptop, determination, and access to the global open source community. The first time someone offered to pay her for a project, she didn't believe it. But she built a messenger bot, earned her first paycheck as a developer, and discovered the enormous opportunity that had opened up to her. Sonia's story is so inspiring. There are brilliant, gifted people all over the world right now who haven't unlocked their potential to contribute to open source. As we look ahead to the dramatic rise in software development that's coming in the next 5 years and beyond, we need to seek out these folks and create a path to open source contribution and, in turn, financial opportunity. We need to make it possible for talented developers to have a thriving, successful career in open source, to get paid for their work, to grow their careers, and contribute their talent to a space where it has the potential to have enormous impact. I'll share some specific ways you can help here a bit later. We've seen what kind of opportunity open source can bring to one person. Let's now flip that and look at this from the other perspective. Let's look at the network effect of a single commit to an open source project. For this example, we picked a commit to the TensorFlow project in June of 2020. This is a real contribution created by a single developer. That commit helped improve TensorFlow, which we know is being used widely around the globe. In the 4 months that have passed since it was made, more than 4,500 developers from over 100 countries have worked directly on the TensorFlow project. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. Let's now look at all of the projects that have leveraged and directly depend on this version of TensorFlow. Within 3 months, that single commit was included in about 23,500 projects on GitHub and anchored in 137 countries around the world. And it was included in the work of more than 50,000 developers from 151 countries. This is incredible. This is the compounding effect of a single contribution. Think about the exponential impact a single developer can have in their career. Multiply that by 100 million and just imagine what this community can do. It honestly gives me goosebumps just to think about the magnitude of what can be achieved. I love this example of what just one commit can lead to. This is Evan Yu, another maintainer who participated in the GitHub README project. He started an open source project called Vue with the intention of building a single JavaScript library that he could reference to improve his own efficiency. He never intended to be a full-time open source maintainer, but you can guess where this is going. That's exactly what he does today. When he open sourced his project, people started using it. The community adopted his idea, built on it, and ultimately helped it evolve into a thriving global community of maintainers, contributors, and users. One thing I love about Vue is Evan's vision for the project is to give any user a low barrier of entry, a good foundation, and room to grow. He said the ideal user is someone who just got into web development, and they're intentionally designing a way for folks to start building without an understanding of how front-end development works. It is this mindset that can have a huge impact on lowering the barrier of entry for new developers in open source. Vue began with the foundation of a single contributor and has evolved to become an integral part of developer workflows. And best of all, it is now fully funded by the community that it serves. I told you about Sonia John earlier, and she said something I think is so insightful. She said, "When I'm building solutions and decide to keep them closed, I recognize that removes an opportunity from someone else. So most of my work is open source." The potential of the community is absolutely massive, and every project, every commit is a building block that the next 50 million developers will be able to learn from and build on. So we all need to focus on getting more people to that first commit because, of course, that's where it all starts. So we've talked about the impact that open source can have on Sonia and other people's lives, and we've talked about the value of a commit. Let's talk about money. The growth of the open source community also has real economic impact. According to Korn Ferry Institute, demand for skilled workers will outstrip supply in the next 10 years, resulting in a global talent shortage of more than 85 million people. If left unchecked, the financial impact of this talent shortage could reach more than $8.4 trillion in unrealized annual revenue by 2030. This is equivalent to the combined GDPs of Germany and Japan. Obviously, these numbers are for a broader group than just developers. This is all skilled jobs. But an increasing number of those jobs will require technical fluency, if not straight coding skills. Open source will play a key role in closing this gap, and in doing so, has the power to help accelerate emerging economies. Let's take a look at one incredibly inspiring program related to this. Laboratoria is a social entrepreneurship project in Latin America that trains women who have been unable to start careers in web or UX design. The organization then connects these women with companies and helps them launch a career in tech. Since its inception, Laboratoria has trained over 1,600 women, and 78% of them have started technology careers in 17 industries. That kind of success can have a huge impact on a local economy. Here's the story of one woman whose life was changed thanks to Laboratoria. Shareni Azcaraga is from Puebla, Mexico. She had to leave a career in music that she loved. She started walking and training neighbors' dogs to make a living in order to support her family. She found and applied for the Laboratoria training program, where she trained as a UX designer. She's now a web developer who draws on her experience in the arts and in dog training to guide users through a well-orchestrated application experience for the program. I share this story because there are several things I've talked about today that form the bigger picture of the opportunity ahead. We need the next 50 million developers to continue to carry the open source community forward and to create the software we'll all depend on in the future. There's so much untapped talent all over the world, and so many people are seeking opportunities to improve their lives through professional achievement, financially, or often both. That talent has the potential to have a lasting positive impact, not only on the lives of individuals, but on innovation and economic growth both locally and more broadly. But to get there, we must continue to remove barriers. In Major League Hacking's most recent Hacker Census, which is a survey of almost 100,000 collegiate hackathon participants, nearly 62% of respondents said that they had not contributed to open source yet. Among them, close to 92% believe that contributing to open source in the future will be important for their career. The main thing holding them back is that they feel like they don't know how to get started or they aren't skilled enough. Organizations like Laboratoria and the View Project are doing amazing work bringing more people into tech and open source and lowering the barriers to getting started. There are so many ways that we can all get involved in paving the way for new developers to join the open source community. I picked a few great examples, but this is far from an exhaustive list. Google Summer of Code is a program focused on bringing more student developers from around the world into open source. Outreachy organizes 3-month paid internships with free and open source software projects for people who are typically underrepresented in those projects. Open Collective gives open source projects a transparent way to collect funding and manage their finances. Community Bridge brings together project maintainers, contributors, and users to fund open source projects, improve code security, and boost the size and diversity of open source communities. Of course, at GitHub, we have GitHub Sponsors, which enables companies and individuals to sponsor projects or specific developers, making open source careers possible for contributors. I'd encourage everyone here to consider sponsoring an individual or a team that is doing great work that impacts you. The Major League Hacking Fellowship provides educational curriculum and practical experience that new developers can put on their resumes right away. Companies can sponsor fellows to work on specific projects at their organization or open source projects in general to help more people enter into careers as developers. These projects and platforms are always seeking supporters, financial sponsors, and mentors to fuel their growth. So I encourage you to get involved in one or more if you're not already, whether that's shining a light on the work they do, supporting them financially, or acting as a mentor for folks going through their programs. In addition, think about the global nature of the developer community. If you're already involved in open source, build your projects and your communities with the needs of developers around the world in mind. Do you need to change anything for your software to be useful for people in emerging economies and mobile-first markets? What about places without fast internet? What about your community? Is it welcoming to new developers, those from different backgrounds and parts of the world? And of course, how do you think about accessibility to be available and useful for as many folks as possible? Lots of food for thought here and a lot of great talks by others on many of the details around building our projects and communities to be inclusive and accessible. What started with a small group of academics and researchers back in the 50s and 60s and led to the free software movement in the 80s and the launch of the open source movement in the 90s is now a community of 50 million people whose efforts and contributions have helped define the world as we know it today. Because of open source, the pace of new software development is blazingly fast, with components for almost anything readily available. Because of open source, there is an abundance of exceptionally high quality software freely available for everyone around the world to use. Because of open source, people globally can learn from the vast array of knowledge and best practices shared openly, helping pave the way for new contributors to open source. It took decades to grow the community to the size that it is today. With your help, in just the next few years, we'll pave the way for the next 50 million developers so that open source can continue to be a key source of innovation, global collaboration, and an engine of human progress. Here's to being 100 million strong. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Erica, thank you for your thoughts on the next generation of open source software developers and what they are going to need to thrive. We now have some time to catch up on the first part of an interesting session in partnership with the Milken Institute called the Credit Markets Outlook, and that's led by Mike Milken himself. There were a number of areas covered. For example, why does corporate credit continue to grow, even as global growth has ground to a halt?
Welcome to Credit Market Outlook. More than $100 trillion is invested in credit markets throughout the world. And as we all know, low interest rates throughout the world have driven the search for yield and the search for the rate of return. There has been dramatic changes this year during the COVID-19 pandemic, and credit has become as volatile as ever during this period of time. Luckily today, we have 4 of the leaders focused on investing in credit in the world. Zhu Ming from the GIC in Singapore, Carl Meyer, Silver Rock in the United States, Robert Petty out of Hong Kong, and David Warren from the United States. Each of them over the past few years has found areas to invest to drive performance and success in their investing. And I'd like to kind of start with Robert today and talk about Asia. Robert has specialized in Asian credits. Dramatic changes have occurred in regulatory, reporting, and opportunity as this region of the world continues to grow and ultimately the largest part of the world's economy. Robert, take us and give us a good look at credit markets in Asia.
Well, thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be with you as always. You know, Asia is such a dynamic and diverse economic and investment region today. It's hard to summarize it. But I think 5 things I just wanted to highlight that we can then discuss perhaps further. First, I think the advent of alternative credit is a phenomenon not just in Asia, but a worldwide phenomenon. But we're certainly seeing the benefits of that. With such a low global rate environment, Asia has been a beneficiary as so many different investors really try and enhance their yield, no longer just doing traditional fixed income, but thinking about the full spectrum of Asia of credit products, and specifically Asia credit products, as people do search for yield. And I do think that phenomenon of just enhanced yield is affecting so many portfolios as people really think about not just a conventional fixed income equity allocation. And that trend is something that is a core component of one of the many trends that's been accelerated in COVID. So we're certainly seeing that here in Asia, and I think it's relevant to why we're seeing incremental capital, because the absolute rate environment, my second point, the absolute rate environment here in Asia is simply compelling. You do have 200, 300 basis point positive rates when you look at the Chinese government bond market. And that's pretty interesting relative to Europe, especially when many people, and we share the view, that the RMB is an appreciating environment. I think the third phenomenon that's worth thinking about is just the continuing divergence between North Asia and South Asia, or if you will, what we call developed Asia, i.e. the North Asian economies anchored by China, but certainly South Korea, Japan. I would include Australia, New Zealand in that. These developed markets are really very similar to Western markets in their scale, their evolution, their regulatory environment, and even perhaps debatably their enforcement environment. And so we think that investors are doing that and differentiating that from perhaps Southeast Asia and other parts in Asia. And I think that, you know, is this really an emerging market still? You know, I think finally the point I really also want to highlight is, you know, ESG matters around the world, and it's not just a buzzword, right? It is fundamentally important to all of us as we as investors are thinking about it. And I think China in their newest 5-year plan, which just happened last month or 2 months ago now, you know, really does matter, and they're focused on it. And I do think we see real opportunities to invest in this, and we can invest in this. And this chart is just a very interesting reality snapshot of, I think, the debate that will be going on for the next episode, and perhaps China and the US in particular. So you see the percentage of GDP that is represented by China at 16% of the world GDP, while 27% of world carbon footprint, and that will be the point that perhaps the Western world will be highlighting. But I think it's also worth highlighting that what China will rightly say is, but please look at the middle chart, where US is 4.3% of the world's population and represents 14.6% of global emissions. And I think that debate may well be something that, first of all, is an investable asset class in China. Getting in front of the 5-year trend is always a good idea with the China's 5-year plan, but also a core debate and an investable asset class here in Asia.
Thank you, Roger. If we're going to turn to an organization that's been very successfully investing in China for a long period of time, now the second largest potential bond market in the world and credit markets in the world. Su Ming, talk to us a little bit about your experience in China. How do you see credit in China? And what do you see the opportunities to invest in credit markets in China?
Sure, happy to. So like you said, we have been investing in China for a long time. In fact, we have set up 2 offices in Shanghai and Beijing for more than 20 years now, especially the one in Beijing. The Chinese market to us is a very precious source of opportunities. And frankly, it is rare to find such a scalable market at this time and age in terms of just the sheer size and capacity of what they can offer. And the other thing, of course, is the diversity of the products and the range of products we can look to invest. So as all of you know, capital markets in China is really looking to develop, and it's really early in the infancy stage. But we already have, like you said, the second largest market already in the world in terms of the size of the bond market. And within that, the larger part of the market today is still very much in bank type policy banks as well as government bonds. But we see the potential for credit markets to really develop and open up over time. And fundamentally, this is something that we think will promote the health of the overall lending system in China so that you can diversify away from bank lending as a source of financing for companies. And as we know, the range of companies that will be sort of going out of China and become the global champions of the world is increasing significantly over time. So we see that as the criteria or some sort of a recipe for capital markets in credit to grow quite substantially in China. The other thing I would also say is that the securitization market today is already the second largest in the world after the United States. And it is only at the infancy stage of the market development today. So when we look at things like consumer credit, auto loans, mortgage securities, and so on, there is a whole range of securities, a whole range of products that we think will be a very interesting opportunity for investors, especially like ourselves, over the long term. And question, of course, is what are the risks and challenges that we deal with in investing in China? Obviously, people talk about the issue with corporate credit as well as the regulatory environment. But I would say that if we take a step back, the whole change in the regulatory environment has actually improved significantly over time. Well, it is not going to be, in a significant change, dramatic in any way over the short term. But we can see that the Chinese officials are serious about trying to improve the governance structure as well as the market structure for credit markets. So we think that this is very positive, and for us, this is a very significant source of investment opportunities for the long term.
Su Ming, when I look at how Europe is developed, and in the United States, really the mid-1970s was the turning point to where we focused eventually on public and private markets financing the country, even as the size of the bank shrunk. And so if we look at the largest banks in the world, if we go back and look at the 1970s, this shows you those largest banks where still in Europe, the vast majority of the financing, if we go back to the previous slide, the vast majority of the financing was still lying in the banks. And even today, more than 10 years after the financial crisis, we still see the majority of credit still lying in the banks in Europe. Do you see the development in Asia more to mirror the United States or more like Europe?
I would say the longer term goal is to move towards the state in the US, but in a way that is much more measured and in a way that addresses the key objectives of the Chinese policymakers. Ultimately, for the Chinese, they would like to preserve social stability, market stability, and ultimately the confidence in the country. So if we think about development of capital markets, I think that kind of mantra has to be brought in line together with the objectives of developing the capital markets and over time evolving that market to the size that they feel comfortable. So I think it's a matter of time horizon. It may not be very fast in a significant way like we just talked about, but in terms of that direction of travel and in terms of the overall priorities from the Chinese, I think it's quite clear that this is going to be one of the areas of key focus for the administration over the long term. And on top of that, I think we also have to understand that the government bond market now increasingly has become a very strategic asset for many investors globally, not just for the local investors. And like we have said earlier, it is large, it has higher yield than many other developed market interest rates, and we believe that it will provide as a diversification and a source of safe haven for portfolio construction. So I think when we have...
Giving you a little taste there of the credit market outlooks. If you'd like to watch the full version of it and then the end of it, please do so on our video on demand site.